It would be hard to argue that perhaps the best time to be both a video game and a wrestling fan was in the late 90s and early 2000s. With the WWF and WCW going head to head for your attention on the screen, and the N64 and PlayStation 1 going head to head for your gaming needs. It was also during this white hot Monday Night Wars era that we got what are to this day some of the best wrestling games ever made. So for today's video we're taking a look back at the history of WCW on the Nintendo 64. With 5 games from 3 different developers and 2 publishers, there's certainly a lot to take in. But as always, if you're wanting a full review of any of these games, then check out the video description where I'll post some links. WCW vs NWO World Tour was the first wrestling game released in the West on the Nintendo 64, and it hit store shelves in late 1997 in North America. Developed by AKI and published by THQ, this partnership would go on to become what most people instantly think of when they think of Nintendo 64 wrestling games. The release date of the game meant that it landed at the peak of WCW's dominance in the TV ratings war, and that's one of the reasons that this game is still the second best-selling wrestling game on the console. It introduced a whole new generation of gamers to just how much fun wrestling games could be. But most importantly, it introduced the grappling system, which would become perhaps the most important element for a successful wrestling game for many years to come. What I always found interesting about this title was that despite the name, there's a distinct lack of both WCW and NWO wrestlers to choose from. The limited roster was definitely disappointing, but if like many of us at the time you were used to even smaller rosters from the 16-bit era wrestling games, it was a little bit more acceptable. WCW vs NWO World Tour is an interesting gameplay experience. Whilst the wrestling mechanics are solid as a rock, the lack of modes and features becomes really apparent when going back to this game if you haven't played it in a while. There's no create a wrestler, no story mode to play through, and even the match types stick to the more traditional styles than the over-the-top matches that wrestling was becoming known for at the time. To counter this though, you can bust open your opponent and enjoy their crimson mask, and the weapon selection is actually fairly balanced. The spirit meter always gave you the feeling that you could make a comeback at any time, even if you're getting your ass handed to you, and the League Challenge mode to unlock wrestlers gave the game a decent amount of replayability. At the time though, this game was something special. Being a fairly early release on the console and realising that cuts had been made to what the developer would have wanted and really intended to release, it made you just think and become even more excited to see what they would bring out next. It's a game which is rough around the edges in a sense that the graphics are passable but limited. The music not drawing enough from the source material hurt it in a way. This almost felt like a cobbled together roster experience, with some Japanese wrestlers thrown in and also some bizarre made up ones taking up space which really should have been used to pump in more WCW talent. But like me, it seems the gaming world loved it. It's still one of the console's best selling titles and was single-handedly the reason for a near 60% jump in THQ's profits in the quarter after the game's release. It achieved a Player's Choice Award, and to this day it's still dirt cheap to pick up and play, which makes this a must-own title in my opinion for any wrestling game fan. WCW vs NWO Revenge was the 1998 follow-up, which is really where AKI went to town and created what is perhaps one of the best wrestling games ever made. They took on board all of the praise and also the criticism that the previous game received, and guess what? They actually acted on it. With developers these days not seemingly giving a damn about what players want as long as they're making some money, then it takes you back to a simpler time when the industry was a little bit different. This time around, wrestler entrances were more creative, the roster was huge in comparison to the first game. Real WCW arenas and pay-per-view sets to wrestle in gave this an instant visual boost, and even managers and valets to escort your chosen grappler and to help you in your battles. Also add to this multiple reversals, instant replays, and additional features for lucha wrestlers such as being able to slide out of the ring, and giants would step over into the ring via the top rope. It was this attention to detail that made wrestling fans go nuts for this title, and it felt like this was a wrestling game which had been made by fans for fans. For the first time it actually felt like your chosen wrestler had some real personality. Take Raven for example. he slumps down in the corner in his renowned pose, whereas Sting will enter the ring, climb the turnbuckle and scream. Some wrestlers also are unable to climb the turnbuckle unless they have special momentum spirit activated, and it's these small details that really made you connect with the game. This time around you're also challenging for real title belts. You choose which one you want to go for and then battle a succession of wrestlers before taking on the champion and then unlocking them. Speaking of wrestlers, pretty much every wrestler on the roster is included in the game. So this time around you get some huge wrestling names like Goldberg, Bret Hart, Chris Jericho. Sadly though, Ric Flair is not in the game, as he only returned to the company at the time when the game was already finished and was about to be released. Each wrestler has over 700 frames of animation, and this time around they even locked down the proper finishers for all of the wrestlers in the game. Whereas WCW vs NWO World Tour had some unusual choices for finishers that sometimes the wrestler had never even used, Revenge changed all of that, and they even added a combo system which can damn near break the game. I've already mentioned wrestling games were good before WCW vs NWO Revenge, but for me personally this was the first time where it honestly felt like a damn near perfect wrestling game. You had greatly improved and varied visuals, a massive roster and secret wrestlers to unlock, more realistic grappling, and some awesome location sets to play in. Aside from adding in real music and having storylines, this was the real pinnacle of what wrestling games had become. So much so in fact that even though this time WWF was starting to make moves in the ratings wars, the game still sold like crazy, selling 1.88 million copies in North America alone. This was another title which quickly helped fill the coffers at THQ that year, and to this day it's still one of the best selling N64 games ever released. Like World Tour, I'd also give this game a must-own title. Now that may sound strange when you consider that they are from the same series and Revenge is the superior title, but I think it's owning both of these because they're so cheap, so much fun to play, and heck, who can ever have too many N64 wrestling games? WCW Nitro is the third and final WCW wrestling game published by THQ on the N64, and it's often forgotten for very good reasons. Released 4 months later than the PlayStation version to mixed reviews, WCW Nitro was ported to the N64 in a very short time period and released just 4 months later than the PlayStation release in early 1999. Whereas WCW vs NWO World Tour and Revenge were developed by AKI, WCW Nitro was instead made by Inland Productions. If you're wondering why that name doesn't ring a bell, it's because their only game before this was a PC fishing game, and they were a new and fairly inexperienced studio. Now this game didn't get released in Europe, so I never played the N64 version when I was a kid, but my brother's friend came over for a sleepover one time and he had the PlayStation 1 version. I remember being super pumped to play it when I saw the THQ logo on the cover and hadn't realised it wasn't the latest AKI wrestling game, but was instead a piece of utter gaming trash. The N64 version features a roster from WCW Thunder on the PlayStation, but the same core game mechanics remain intact. That means an insanely fast-paced experience which is frankly ridiculous to play, and it makes it feel like you're watching a wrestling match at double speed. In some instances you literally get no opportunity to attack your opponent and they'll quickly pounce on you, continue to pound you to the mat, and then pin you for the 1-2-3. Whilst I will admit that the roster is okay with 16 starting wrestlers and over 40 more to unlock, and that's not forgetting the limited commentary which is actually a welcome addition, it's the lack of selling in the game that was a major turn-off. You can hit your opponent with pretty much any move and they'll instantly pop right up, selling like Hulk Hogan. This makes the bouts feel more like Mortal Kombat than a wrestling match, and when you become more accustomed to the slower and more methodical pace of the AKI wrestling games, it makes this feel like an utter shambles. The controls are terrible, there's no promo videos on the N64 version, and the graphics are really bad. This is just a wrestling game that defiled the WCW brand on Nintendo 64, and this is easily one of the low points when it comes to wrestling on the console, so just avoid this one at all costs. Sadly though, that was the last partnership between WCW and THQ. With the wrestling licenses going through a merry-go-round at the time, this left WCW ready to be picked up by Acclaim, who had just lost the WWF license. That is, however, what most people were expecting to happen, but just like the crazy world of professional wrestling, everything has its twists and turns, and a surprise entrant made their move into the professional wrestling game arena. WCW Mayhem hit store shelves in 1999 and was developed by Kodiak Interactive and published by everyone's favourite gaming company, Electronic Arts. EA could just smell the greenback when professional wrestling was booming, and being the huge company they are, it was only a matter of time before they realised that they can make some quick dollar in the same way they have done with annual sports games from the likes of Madden and FIFA. Now, to give EA some credit, the game did contain many firsts for a professional wrestling game, such as having all pay-per-view and TV show arenas, backstage areas which could be brawled in, but an even more cool feature was included. The pay-per-view mode allows you to enter codes which were actually given out on WCW television at the time to get the same match lineups in the game. This was an innovative feature, and although it only lasted a few months, it was nevertheless a very cool way to blur the lines between wrestling on TV and in video games. That's pretty much where the positive notes end, however. The game is a definite improvement over Nitro. The character models are perhaps the best looking ones on Nintendo 64, and I was genuinely surprised just how much wrestling detail they actually were able to put on the character models. It's just the gameplay isn't all that fun. Matchups feel like a chore to play, and pulling off moves often leads to you performing the same move over and over. There's a much more limited moveset than you'll have become used to by this point. I guess you could say it's a game which is all style over substance, something which EA were known for at the time and perhaps still are known for to this day. Despite having 50 or so wrestlers in the game, some decent commentary and entrance music, everything when you're actually in the game falls pretty flat. The engine just isn't developed enough, which leads to a whole ton of clipping, character models which move around the ring in a very stiff manner, and it seems like they went something along the lines of the Acclaim wrestling games than the better AKI THQ ones. Whilst WCW TV may have had weekly countdowns to the game's release, when it finally arrived it failed to set the world alight. Reviews were mixed, with the common themes being criticism for the hit detection and lack of moves, but praise for the awesome audio and graphics. It's a game which I think is worth playing but not owning. It's a game which you might get some enjoyment from, seeing the large roster for nostalgic purposes, and also hearing music from, tracks like the NWO Wolfpack theme. But just don't go into this game expecting it to be one of the better WCW games around. WCW Backstage Assault is the fifth and final WCW game on the console, and in fact the last WCW game ever made, as the company was then sold to the WWF. I'd have personally loved to have seen the company's last game go out with a bang, but in late 2000 we got one of the strangest entries, which to be honest is more of a spin-off than an actual wrestling game. You may be old enough to remember the previews that WCW TV would show for WCW Mayhem. In particular, one of those previews, I think it was on Nitro one time, showed Goldberg in-game spearing somebody through a house wall. That area was never actually seen in the final build of the game, but it was perhaps removed because EA had a different idea. WCW Backstage Assault completely removes the ring altogether, and instead you're left with a wrestling game that takes place entirely in backstage areas. Now on paper this sounds like a cool concept, but in reality it really doesn't work. The main gameplay mode here is the Hardcore Challenge, which is where you'll play a seemingly endless run of matches to unlock new areas, wrestlers and moves for your creator wrestler. After you win the championship, that's it, game over, and you'll never get the chance to actually defend the title that you've just spent hours winning. Now I do respect the company's decision to try something fresh rather than just an update to WCW Mayhem, but there's no improvements to the biggest issues that people had with WCW Mayhem, which was the lack of moves and the terrible gameplay. If anything, this game just further highlights the game's weak engine and its overall flaws. You'll constantly be clipping objects, struggling with fiddly controls, and the bizarre score system really doesn't work in a wrestling game. Across all platforms, the game was a commercial failure, selling a combined 200,000 copies. To put that in perspective, that's 9 times less than the peak of WCW games, which was Revenge, and that game was an N64 exclusive. In a strange way though, I'd probably still recommend giving this game a play, even if for novelty purposes. It's a game that's so craptastic it's almost so bad you've got to play it just to see how bad it is. Now I don't think it deserves the title as the worst wrestling game ever as some people call it, but it's certainly a low point at the same time the company was, well, going through a low point because they went bust. If you're a completionist then you'll love this game, as you need to unlock pretty much everything in it, and the roster is actually quite cool to see who was still around WCW at the time. But if anything, it's a time capsule of a game where the final hurrah of the 90s attitude was coming to an end and WCW was finally being put out of its misery. So there you have it, 5 WCW games which were on Nintendo 64, and so for today's conversation topic, I'd love to know which one you personally loved the most and also which one you hated the most. I'd also love to hear any memories you have of playing these games with your friends or family in the comment section down below, and if you'd like a WWF video in this series, then also let me know in the comments too, and I'll see what I can do in the coming weeks. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time.